Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. Today, we'll be discussing the rise in payer use cases that require accurate identity matching and how the Verato Universal MPI is uniquely poised to solve these new match issues. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly cover some housekeeping items. This webinar is only 30 minutes, and we have a lot of content to cover, so we will do our best to answer questions at the end. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them through the chat panel at any time. If we're unable to get to questions at the end of the webinar, we will follow up individually with anyone who asked a question. If you missed something or want to share the session with a colleague, we will be recording the webinar and we'll follow up with all attendees with links to the recording. Now I'd like to quickly introduce our speaker, John Case, before handing the mic over to him. John is a senior solutions architect with Verato and has been working in the MDM space for over 10 years. He has both a broad and deep understanding of healthcare data management. And because of this unique experience, we're very excited to have him hosting our webinar today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, John.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to get started. So what I'd like to cover is really three broad items in the agenda. The first is just talking about the statement that we made at the title of the webinar, which is that conventional MDM solutions have reached their limits. There's some challenges that folks are seeing in the payer industry, and you can't necessarily address that with the current state of the art with master data management. The second item is talking more about some of these new use cases that are creating different challenges. These will likely be familiar to most folks in the audience. And then the last item is talking a bit more about Verato's Universal MPI, what it is, how it's different, and how it can address different challenges that you can't address with the current state of the art in the market. So the first thing we'll talk about is current master data management solutions. There's some different acronyms used here, so I'll just kind of cover those up front. So MDM is master data management. Folks are probably aware of what that acronym is. It's really the technology that most organizations, payer organizations in particular, are using to deal with the challenge of identifying when you have the same member, the same patient, the same person, whatever you call that identity. When you have multiple versions of a person's identity from different databases and you're trying to figure out if it's the same or not, most organizations are using MDM or master data management to deal with that. There's another acronym, MPI, Master Person Index or Master Patient Index, and that's essentially the same technology. It's more narrowly scoped, really just around person data in healthcare, but that's ultimately the problem that we're talking about here. Whether you're applying a product that calls itself MPI or MDM, it's really the same thing. And so when we say that these solutions have reached their limits, what do we mean by that? What limit are we talking about? And really the limit is based on the fact that when you're using a master data management solution, you are relying on the data that you feed into it, your data that you receive within your organization, maybe even from outside your organization. Whatever data you give to the MDM system, that's what it has to work with. But there is a limit to how much it can do with that data. And that limit is largely because of the fact that data is not always very good. In our experience, and this has been seen in other studies elsewhere, and it's been reinforced with our own experience working with customers and working with data. Typically about 30% or more of demographic data in any sort of data set, whether it's the data in your MDM, the data in an enterprise warehouse, you gather all that data, and about 30% of that demographic data is out of date, incorrect, or incomplete. And so when your master data management solution is telling you when you have the same person represented on different database records, different records from claims, from membership, what have you, if 30% of the information is wrong, then it's going to have a hard time giving you the right answer when that's all the data that you have to work with. And there's lots of different reasons that data can be wrong, right? Things change over time naturally. People's addresses change, their phones change, people's names change, last names change often when people get married or divorced. About 18% of people a year have some sort of change like this. Then there's just ambiguities, right? Even when the data is not wrong, you can have twins who have very similar looking data that can make you think they're the same person. You can have parents and children with the same name because they're junior and senior. You can have variations in how names are represented because, in some cultures, names are represented first name, last name, and others it's last name, first name. There's just ambiguities. The data is not wrong, but it may be different between one record and another because of these ambiguities. Then, of course, you have actual errors, spelling errors, typos, transcription errors when someone's taking information from a form and typing it into the screen. Even if the person themselves is entering their own data into a website, they can mistype their own data. It happens. Information over the phone can get misheard and typed in incorrectly. So there's lots of ways that errors can be introduced. And then, of course, there's also just incompleteness. Sometimes you legitimately don't have data. It's just missing. That could be because you were never given it from the member or the patient. It could be because you're receiving data from another organization, a provider organization, an ACO organization, and they may have Social Security number, but they're just not going to give it to you. There's also default data. If that Social Security number is missing, someone just might enter 111111111, and it's no longer missing, but it's still not useful to you because it's a defaulted entry, and it's arguably worse than missing data. And some data sources just have thinner, sparser data, and so all of these, for all these reasons, it becomes harder for an MDM system or any sort of matching approach to deal with that data and give you the right answers and tell you where you have the same person duplicated. And the problem's compounded because more and more sources of data, more and more uses of data are coming into the ecosystem of master data management. So it used to be that master data management was fed with membership data, your active members, and that's generally pretty good quality data. It's very homogeneous, and you can configure your matching algorithm to match it pretty well. You can give lots of different fuzzy matching, probabilistic matching techniques and do a pretty good job. But more and more data is either being fed into the MDM system or being used to query or search against the MDM system. And the wider variety of data sources you get, the more inconsistent the data becomes, the more errors you see, the more sparse data you see. You start to see discrepancies between, how many fields from your membership data file overlap with this population health file you got from some ACO organization, or a stream of HL7 ADT messages that you got from a provider organization that you're working with. And so suddenly those different data sources, which may not even be in your MDM, are still trying to be used in the MDM ecosystem, and it becomes harder to correctly identify the right person. And if we look at an example of this, the approach that an MDM system takes is it tries to directly match head-to-head two different identity records. So if I have a source of member data that has a member ID and a name and a Social Security number and a street address, and then I have some clinical data from another source that has a date of birth and an older address and maybe a different name, maybe someone's maiden name before they got married, when you compare those two things head-to-head, they don't look very similar. There's not a lot in common. You might have some overlap in part of the name information. One of them has an SSN, the other doesn't. One has a birth date, the other doesn't. You just can't look at those two records in isolation and definitively say that they're the same person. This is really a great illustration of how you come upon the limitation of what you're doing in the matching in an MDM system. These could very well be the same person. You're just looking at different snapshots of that person. There's some data, currency issue. One has an old address, old name. There's also some sparseness issue. One has an SSN, one doesn't. One has a date of birth, one doesn't. And so when you try to match them up, you're hitting a limit based on the data that you're working with. Now there's some other challenges about just the use cases that are being seen by payer organizations. It's not just take my active membership and tell me when I have duplicates. There's some definite new challenges popping up that are testing the limits of these MDM solutions. There's a statistic about telehealth that over half of large employers are offering telehealth services, more opportunity for more data to come in through different channels of different quality and different completeness that you're going to have to deal with. More and more there's coordination across organizations, payment transfers between insurers participating in risk adjustment programs or doing coordination of benefits across organizations, never mind how much do you trust your own MDM's ability to accurately identify a person. Now you're trying to coordinate with a completely different enterprise, and you're getting their version of someone's identity. You don't know how well they're matching it to your data. You don't know how much to trust the information. Now it becomes really challenging to say whether or not you're talking about the same person. Then you get into, ACOs. We're expecting to double the number of ACOs by 2020. Massive amounts of people are going into value-based programs. So there's going to be an ever-increasing amount of information being shared between payers and providers, ACOs. More and more data that's coming from a provider or a clinical setting is suddenly going to be, in your hands. You're trying to make sense of it and trying to rationalize it against your own membership data, and that can be a good thing. There's great opportunity in that, but it also becomes even more challenging for those existing MDM systems to try to tell you when is there a match between these records, because you may have tuned it very well to your membership data, but now you've got more and more provider source data coming in. So an example, a payer organization that we worked with was having a challenge because one of the things that they're doing is they're taking laboratory result data that comes from the labs, and they're trying to match it up to their membership records. And they're doing this for the purpose of quality of care reporting, HEDIS reporting as an example. And so there's dozens of different reports that they generate about the quality of care that they're providing. And the levels of care that they can demonstrate through the data, through the reporting, has an impact financially on their business. It has an impact on revenue that they generate. It has an impact on penalties that they can incur, or money that can be withheld if they don't reach certain levels of quality of care. And their ability to report on that is really based on how well can I take these laboratory results and match them up to my member records. If I have a set of members that I know are diabetic, then I need to get their blood test laboratory records to be able to measure what percentage of them actually had a hemoglobin test in the past 6 months, and what percentage of them scored, too high or too low on that hemoglobin test. That's just one of dozens of examples where you have to be able to match up the laboratory result or some other sort of clinical data with the membership data. And the challenge is that these laboratory results are very sparse. They don't contain the same richness of information that the payer has within their own membership data. So it's really tricky for them to be able to definitively match those up. So that's an example of a new challenge, and we'll talk more about what Verato has done for that client and what the outcome of that is. Another example is some other payers that we've worked with have come to us not necessarily to address a specific use case like the quality care reporting I talked about, but more to augment what they're already doing with their existing master data management. So one of the things that these payer organizations have come to us with is the fact that they have an existing MDM solution in place to try to create a single view of the member or single view of the patient across different data sources. But the challenge is that the more and more data they feed into it, the more and more that the MDM system encounters data that it can't quite decide if two records are a match or not. They might come close to matching, but they're not close enough. And so like any MDM system, it takes these close but not close enough matches, and it queues them up into a data stewardship queue to be reviewed manually. And there's literally millions of tasks sitting in this review. You're never going to manually review millions of these tasks, no matter how many people you put on the project. No one's going to go staff a team of 500 people to go manually review 1 million, 2 million, 3 million potentially matching identities. So what you end up doing is you just say, I'm either going to ignore it entirely, maybe even turn off this ability in my MDM system, not even queue them up at all, or I'm going to queue them up and let them sit there, but I'm really not going to do much about it. Every once in a while, I may make some token effort to try to clean these up. And so that's that's really to a large degree, these close but not close enough matches are falling into these scenarios where the identities are just a little bit ambiguous because of missing data, incorrect data, out of date information. And so the promise of what you thought you were getting with master data management isn't quite being met. Every organization that deploys MDM had some sort of business case for MDM. I'm going to identify duplicates between these 5 sources of data, and it's going to improve customer service by X%, and it's going to improve claims efficiency Y by Y%, and it all justified itself. It justified the expense of MDM. But if 10, maybe 15, maybe even 20% of the identities that you feed into this thing end up in this manual review queue, then you're falling short of the the business case that you set for MDM by that same 10, 15, 20% margin. So you're definitely not living up to the business case that you had hoped to get. So this is certainly something we've seen from payers. Now, what Verato is doing and bringing to the table here is a different approach to identifying patient identities, member identities, and it's something that we call referential matching. And really, in a nutshell, when we compare the traditional probabilistic matching or pairwise matching that happens in an MDM system or an EMPI system with what Verato does, if I go back to that example we talked about earlier, I've got a record with a social security number and a name and an address, and then I have a different record with a birth date and a name and an old address. When I compare them against each other, just one-to-one in a traditional MPI or MDM system, they don't match. They're not close enough to match. But what Verato does with referential matching is we take a reference database, essentially an answer key of people in the United States, and we compare those 2 records to our answer key. And we line them up to the same person. The SSN, the name, the address lines up to the right person in our referential database. And then the second record from the lab data also lines up to that same person. Yes, it might be using an older address or a maiden name, but we have that history in our reference database. So through referential matching, we're able to tell that these are in fact the same person. And so we can find matches that other solutions are missing, and we can close that gap in those missed matches from a traditional MDM system. And just to give you a little bit more, of a real example with real data here, if those 2 records that we were talking about, one was a Catherine Smith who lives on Main Street and there's a birth date, the other is a Kathy Johnson with a different address on Elm Road and a phone number, by itself, those 2 records don't look similar enough to say that they are or are not the same person. You'd probably be inclined to say they're not the same person. But inside of our reference database, we know that Catherine has gone by Catherine and Kathy. We know that she got married and changed her name from Johnson to Smith. We know that she has lived at multiple addresses. We know that she's got multiple phone numbers over time. And so we can connect the dots between your payer records on the left and right with our reference database and be able to tell you those are in fact the same person. So if we come back to the example we were talking about before, the payer organization that was trying to link together laboratory results with its own membership records to improve the outcome of its quality of care reporting, Verato was able to use our referential matching to give a 25% uplift in the proportion of member records and laboratory records that they were able to bring together. And this has massive implications on the organization. Never mind the fact that you're finding more matches. What it ultimately means is you're improving and getting a more accurate picture of your healthcare quality of care reporting. So if you used to think that X% of your diabetic members had a hemoglobin test in the last month, and you realize it's actually 10% higher than that, that's massively important to you. That in and of itself could increase the revenue that you're getting from a value-based program, or it could avoid you incurring a penalty based on the contract you have with your client. It could bump you up into a different star rating category entirely. More likely, the collective uplift across probably dozens of reports could bump you up into an entirely different star rating, which could really impact your ability to continue winning business in the future. So there's a lot of different bottom line implications for an organization getting this sort of uplift. Even though it sounds like, okay, great, I changed the numbers on some reports, it can be massively important in terms of the bottom line. The other example we talked about was payer organizations who came to Verato with this challenge of having these really big queues of manual review items in their existing MDM solution. So these are examples where we're not having to tell the payer to throw out their existing MDM solution. They can keep using it, but we can augment it with something that we call an auto steward service. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit, where we can take all those potentially matching identities from the data stewardship queue and use them to compare to our referential matching and give you answers automatically without the need for manual review. And depending on the type of data, the quality of data, we've seen with different payers anywhere from 50% all the way up to 2/3 of the records in those data stewardship queues can be automatically resolved with Verato using our referential matching, and they could not be matched with the traditional MDM matching. So it's definitely a big uplift, and it's something that really can be complementary to an existing MDM system. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to replace it, and it doesn't have to be a threat to the organization, so to speak. So, let's talk a little bit about the Verato Universal MPI. I mean, we're really uniquely suited to address these new challenges. And the Verato Universal MPI is really different and groundbreaking for a number of reasons. One is this referential matching that I talked about. We have a pre-populated reference database of people in the United States nationwide that has demographics going back, potentially up to 30 years with address history, name change history, phone numbers, et cetera. All the data is there. We essentially have the answer key to be able to solve these tougher matching problems through this referential matching. And the system is also pre-tuned and pre-mastered. It doesn't need to be tuned to figure out how much weight should I give to the name John within a given client's data set. We have all the correct answers in the database. So it's really already tuned to the population, and so there's a lot less time required to implement the solution. So that referential matching architecture, like I said, not only is it more accurate, but it also makes a difference in terms of the deployment time. MDM projects that would take months, usually years, can happen a lot faster with this solution because there's a lot less tuning required. The other thing that's really important about this is that it's all cloud-based. You can just literally plug into a set of web services. You don't have to worry about upgrades. You don't have to worry about procuring servers, maintaining database licenses. All of that stuff goes away. It's all available as a SaaS-based service. We deal with that for you, and it dramatically impacts the ease with which you can deploy this kind of solution. So it's the accuracy of the referential matching, the fact that it's less tuning required, the fact that it's very easy to deploy in the cloud. All of these things make it a very different and groundbreaking solution compared to what's available with other traditional MDM and MPI approaches. And the Verato Universal MPI is not, it's not just one thing. It's really a platform through which we offer different services and different capabilities. You can mix and match them based on what you need. Now, I know that we just talked about this being in the cloud. We're talking about healthcare. We have extremely stringent security requirements that we meet. We go through third-party auditing to certify that we meet the standards. We're high trust certified. We have HIPAA security and privacy regulations, payment card industry regulations. So we go through extremely stringent security checks. And every one of our customers, puts us to the test and has us go through a very stringent assessment to make sure that they're satisfied with our security, and every single time they are. We get them to that point, but it's never been an issue, the fact that we're operating in the cloud. In fact, we're probably more secure than a lot of people's own environments and infrastructure is. So off of that cloud-based platform with the referential matching, there's a number of capabilities that we offer. And the first is a service that we call Link. And this truly is what most people think of as an MPI, a master person index. It's a cloud-based master person index where we link together all of your person identities within and across different data sources. These can be data sources that your own data that you've generated for membership. It can be data that's come to you from providers, from government agencies, immunization records, lots of a variety of data that you may not be able to match up in a traditional MDM or MPI, we can match it accurately in our link solution. Now, there's other organizations who have an existing MDM system that they're going to keep in place, but they're trying to solve this problem of all these potential matches queuing up in their data stewardship queue. And so we have a different offering called our Auto Steward offering, where you can plug this in alongside your existing MDM solution so that we can take all those potential matches that are queuing up in your data stewardship queue and give you the answers back. Yes, these are actually the same person. No, these are not the same person. They're definitely two different people. And we know that because we have our referential matching. We have the answer key to be able to solve those tougher matching challenges. Not only do we give you the answer, but we also give you the supporting evidence to say, here's why we think these are the same person. Here's why we think these are not the same person. And then lastly, there's a third service that we call Validate, which is validating the identity data of your members and your patients. And this can be in bulk. It can be as a web service one at a time, depending on what makes sense for your use case. And really what you're doing is you're coming to Verato and saying, here is my version of this John case identity. Here's his name, here's his birth date, here's his address. Can you, Verato, validate this against your reference database? So we go and we check and we say, yes, we know John Case in our reference database. So he's a real person. That's useful in and of itself to know. And we can validate that, yes, you have the correct birth date for him, you have the correct address, and you have his name as John. We think his more correct name is Jonathan. So there's a variation of that name that we've just given you as part of that validation, so that you can fill in blanks when you've got missing information or incorrect information, or just different variations of the information. And that can be very beneficial, not even just to an MDM program. It certainly could be used to augment an existing MDM program, but it could even be used just to augment a business process that's completely independent of master data management. You may have a claim business process where you are taking claim information from provider offices and you're checking your own membership data to see, is this a person that's insured? Are they eligible for the services? And if so, should I pay the claim? And most of the time, your processing automatically finds the answer. And a small percentage of the time, your processing doesn't find the answer. The information that you got from the provider doesn't quite match up with what you know about your member. And so you may say, well, I have to reject this, or it has to be routed to a secondary manual process for someone to look into. Manual gets very expensive. If you plug the Validate service into that process, Verato can validate the information, and the Verato may have a correction to a name or a birth date, and you can take that correction and rerun it through your claim process, and suddenly you do get the right answer and zero in on the right member automatically instead of going through a manual secondary process, which can be very time-saving and money-saving. So that's just an example of where you can plug that service in. Now, we recognize that Verato is a new company with a very new, innovative solution, and so people may want to put it to the test a little bit, and we're happy to do that. There's typically a couple of things we do for organizations that are looking to put us to the test. One is just diagnosing the quality of information that you have about your members. We can take a look and see how well are you matching the data that you have. Can we match it better? How well are you capturing correct information? Can we point out inaccuracies in your information? That's the diagnose approach. Other organizations just choose to pilot the use of Verato around a specific business process. Maybe you're focused on that data stewardship queue in an MDM system, and you want a pilot where you can explore how well can Verato resolve these data stewardship tasks sitting in my data stewardship queue. And so we're happy to create a pilot scenario or a proof of concept scenario to help you test drive that case to see how much better we can do and what sort of uplift we can give you. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Stephanie. I apologize, I used up most of the time here, so we may have to do the Q&A separately as you suggested.
Great, yeah, thank you, John. So we are right up against the 2:30 end of the webinar. We did see a couple questions come through the chat panel, so we'll be following up with you individually to answer your question right after the webinar is over. On that note, if anybody has additional questions you'd like to send through, we still have time to capture them and can follow up with you after as well. So just a reminder that we had recorded the webinar, so we will be sending that out to you all in an email shortly, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And if you have a burning desire for more information, feel free to check out Verato.com, and we look forward to continuing the conversation soon. Thank you all so much.